The cold night air seeped through the cracks of the old farmhouse as Sarah crept barefoot down the hallway, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she followed the low murmur of voices drifting from the parlor. She had woken to the sound of her father's harsh whisper, and something in his tone had filled her with a dread she couldn't ignore. Pressing herself against the wall, she peered through the narrow gap in the doorway, her eyes widening in horror as she saw her father, her uncle, and her older brother huddled close around the fire, their faces twisted with greed and malice. "Tonight," her father snarled, slamming his fist on the table, "we end this problem for good. Sarah knows too much about our deal with Victor Kane. If she talks, everything we've built crumbles." Her uncle nodded, his thin lips curling into a cruel smile. "We'll make it look like an accident. The girl wanders too close to the river, slips on the ice. No one will question it." Sarah's stomach churned as her brother added coldly, "I'll take her out there myself. She's always trusted me." A sickening silence followed before her father hissed, "Do it before dawn. Victor pays us at sunrise." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Tears burning her eyes, but her heel caught on a loose floorboard, and the creak shattered the moment. The three men turned as one, their eyes locking on the shadows where she hid. "She heard us!" her uncle shouted, his voice sharp with panic. "Get her!" Sarah's breath came out in a strangled sob as she bolted down the hall, her feet slipping on the wooden floor as she flung open the back door and plunged into the frigid darkness. Behind her, the roar of male voices and the pounding of boots filled the night. Snowflakes stung her face as she ran blindly across the yard, her nightdress tangling around her legs, her lungs screaming for air. "Sarah!" her brother bellowed, his voice laced with fury. "Stop, or so help me, I'll—" A gunshot cracked through the night, the bullet splintering a fence post beside her head, sending her screaming into the trees. She stumbled and fell, the world spinning, but before rough hands could seize her, a deep, commanding voice cut through the chaos. "Let her go." Out of the darkness rode a lone cowboy, his wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow, his storm-gray eyes glinting like steel in the moonlight. In one smooth motion, he drew his revolver and fired, a shot so precise it knocked the weapon from her brother's hand. The family scattered in shock as the stranger's massive horse slid to a halt beside Sarah. Without a word, he reached down and hauled her onto the saddle, his arm a band of iron around her trembling body. Sarah clutched his coat, sobbing, as he spurred the horse into a full gallop, the furious shouts of her family fading behind them. The wind tore at her hair as she buried her face against his chest, her voice breaking as she cried, "They're my family. Why do they want me dead?" The cowboy's jaw tightened, his gaze never wavering from the dark horizon ahead. "Because you know the truth," he said grimly, his deep voice a promise and a warning. "And men like them will kill to keep it buried." Snow whipped at Sarah's face as the horse thundered through the dark forest, her fingers clutching desperately at the stranger's coat, her body shaking not only from the cold, but from the crushing weight of betrayal, as her own family's voices still rang in her ears like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Behind them, shouts and hooves faded into the distance, but the fear of being caught gnawed at her chest with every breath. The cowboy's strong arm kept her steady as he leaned low, urging the horse faster through narrow, twisting trails. Only he seemed to know, his storm-gray eyes scanning the darkness with calm precision. After what felt like endless miles, they reached a hidden clearing where a small cabin stood half-buried beneath a blanket of snow, its stone chimney sending a thin wisp of smoke into the freezing night. Caleb swung down in one smooth motion, lifting Sarah from the saddle as though she weighed nothing, his voice low and steady as he said, "We're safe here, for now." He carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind them. The cabin was simple, but warm, lit by a flickering fire that filled the room with golden light. Caleb set Sarah gently on a fur-covered bench, then knelt to stoke the flames higher, his movements calm but efficient. Sarah's teeth chattered as she whispered, "Who are you? Why did you help me?" Caleb turned, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the firelight, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "Name's Caleb," he said quietly. "I've seen enough blood spilled by men like Victor Kane to know when someone's running for their life." Sarah flinched at the name, fresh tears spilling down her dirt-streaked cheeks. "Victor. He's the reason they want me dead," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I overheard my father and uncle making a deal with him. They're selling our land illegally, and I heard everything. If I speak, they lose everything. And Victor loses his grip on the whole county." Caleb's jaw tightened, the firelight catching the scar along his cheek. "Victor Kane destroyed my family years ago," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "Burned our ranch to the ground when my father wouldn't sell. I buried them with my own hands." His storm-gray eyes met hers, a silent understanding passing between them. Sarah wiped her tears, her voice trembling. "I don't know where else to go. They'll hunt me until I'm dead." Caleb rose to his full height, towering and steady, his voice calm but fierce. "Then we make them regret hunting you." Outside, the distant echo of howls and hooves carried through the night, a chilling reminder of the men already searching. Caleb moved swiftly, barring the windows and checking his rifle. "Victor's men will come," he said, "and when they do, they'll expect a scared girl. They won't be ready for me." Sarah's breath caught as she watched him work, a strange mix of terror and hope stirring in her chest. She whispered, "Why would you risk your life for me? You don't even know me." Caleb paused, glancing over his shoulder, his voice rough with unspoken pain. "Because no one was there to save my family," he said simply. "I won't let them take you too." Sarah's heart ached at the quiet strength in his words, but before she could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the forest. A rifle shot, close and deliberate. Caleb's eyes hardened as he blew out the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. "They've found us," he said grimly, his hand closing over hers. "Stay quiet, stay low, and whatever happens, don't let go." The cabin plunged into darkness as Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her fingers clutching Caleb's rough hand, while the echo of the rifle shot faded into the howling wind outside, followed by the crunch of boots on snow and the low murmur of men's voices drawing closer, their torches casting wavering shadows through the cracks in the cabin walls. Caleb's storm-gray eyes glinted faintly in the dark as he crouched beside the window, his voice a whisper sharp as a blade. "They've tracked you fast. These aren't just hunters. They're Victor's best men." Sarah trembled, her heart pounding so loudly she feared they would hear it. "What do they want to do to me?" she breathed, barely able to form the words. Caleb's jaw tightened, his voice low and deadly calm. "Silence you, permanently." Outside, one of the men barked an order. "Surround the cabin. Victor wants her alive, but don't be gentle with the cowboy." Caleb's grip tightened on his rifle. He turned to Sarah, his expression hard but protective. "When I tell you to run, you don't look back. You ride like hell until you reach the ridge with the big split rock. There's a path there they won't expect. Understand?" Sarah shook her head violently, tears streaking her face. "I'm not leaving you." Caleb didn't argue. He simply pressed a revolver into her shaking hands and whispered, "Then stay low and fight if you have to." The first torch hit the cabin window with a crash, flames licking at the wooden frame as shouts erupted. Caleb moved with lightning speed, throwing himself to the side and firing through the shattered window. A man screamed and fell, his torch tumbling into the snow. "They're in the trees!" another shouted. Gunfire roared, splinters flying as bullets tore through the cabin walls. Caleb grabbed Sarah and pulled her down behind an overturned table, shielding her with his body as smoke began to curl through the air. Sarah sobbed, clinging to the revolver, her whole body shaking. "We're going to die," she whispered. Caleb's voice was fierce, unyielding. "Not if I can help it." With a swift motion, he shoved a small satchel toward her. "Powder and shot. When I say, you throw it into the fire." Sarah's eyes widened in terror, but she nodded, trusting him completely. Suddenly, the cabin door burst open and a massive man charged through, his face hidden beneath a scarf. Caleb tackled him before he could reach Sarah, the two men crashing into the table with a bone-rattling thud. They grappled fiercely, fists flying, until Caleb managed to drive a knife into the man's side. The attacker fell, gasping, as Caleb whirled back to Sarah. "Now!" he shouted. Sarah, hands trembling, hurled the satchel into the roaring fire. The explosion shook the cabin, blasting the door from its hinges and throwing men outside to the ground in confusion. Caleb grabbed Sarah, dragging her through the back exit into the freezing night. "Run!" he roared, shoving her toward the waiting horse. Sarah scrambled into the saddle, Caleb swinging up behind her as bullets whined past their ears. They tore through the forest at a breakneck pace, branches whipping Sarah's face as she clung to Caleb's coat. Behind them, furious voices rose as Victor's men regrouped, their torches spreading like wildfire through the trees. Sarah's breath came in ragged sobs. "They'll never stop, will they?" Caleb's voice was grim and resolute as he spurred the horse faster. "Not while Victor's alive," he said, his tone like steel. "But I swear to you, Sarah, we'll make our stand and end this hunt for good." The horse thundered through the frozen forest, its hooves pounding like war drums as Sarah clung to Caleb, her face buried against his back, the icy wind cutting through her thin nightdress, while the shouts of Victor's men echoed faintly behind them, growing more distant with each desperate stride. Yet Caleb knew they were far from safe, and would never be until the man pulling the strings was destroyed. At last, he guided the horse into a narrow ravine and slowed to a trot, listening intently to the silence around them before turning into a hidden path that wound between towering pines. Finally stopping at an abandoned hunting cabin deep in the wilderness, Caleb lifted Sarah from the saddle, his strong hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins, and set her gently on her feet, his storm-gray eyes scanning the shadows before speaking in a low, urgent voice. "We'll rest here, but only for a moment. They'll keep coming." Sarah's lips trembled as she clutched his coat, her voice breaking. "Why won't they stop? Why does Victor want me dead so badly?" Caleb's jaw tightened, his breath misting in the cold as he finally told her what he had long suspected. "Victor Kane isn't just a rancher. He's a tyrant who owns half this county and aims to control the rest. He's been forcing families off their land for years, buying or stealing everything he touches. Your family struck a deal with him to sell illegally, and you overheard the truth. That makes you dangerous to him." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "I thought my father loved me. I thought my brother would protect me." Caleb's voice softened for the first time, a deep, aching note beneath his steady tone. "Sometimes blood is the deepest betrayal." Even as the words hung in the air, the sound of distant hoofbeats shattered the fragile calm. Caleb's head snapped up, his instincts honed like a blade. "He's here," he said grimly, pulling Sarah toward the cabin. They barely had time to bar the door before the night exploded with noise, torches blazing outside, horses snorting, and a commanding voice Sarah would never forget. Victor Kane himself rode into the clearing on a massive black stallion, his fine coat immaculate despite the snow, his cold blue eyes glittering with cruelty. "Come out, girl," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the trees. "Your family couldn't finish the job, so I'll do it myself." Sarah gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth, while Caleb's expression turned to stone. "Stay behind me," he ordered, loading his rifle with swift, precise motions. Victor dismounted slowly, his boots crunching in the snow as he stalked toward the cabin, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Caleb," he called mockingly, "I thought you'd have learned your lesson after what happened to your family. You really think you can defy me and live?" Caleb's storm-gray eyes burned with fury as he whispered to Sarah, "This man burned my ranch to the ground and killed everyone I loved. Saving you isn't just about you, it's about ending him." Before she could respond, Victor gestured sharply, and a dozen armed riders surged forward, surrounding the cabin. Caleb shoved Sarah toward a trap door hidden beneath a rug. "Go," he hissed. "Follow the tunnel and don't stop until you see daylight." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I won't leave you!" Caleb grabbed her shoulders, his voice fierce. "If they take you, everything's lost." Reluctantly, she slid into the darkness just as the cabin door splintered under Victor's men. Caleb turned, rifle raised, ready to face the man who had haunted his past and now threatened his future, while Sarah crawled blindly through the narrow tunnel, praying she would survive long enough to come back for him. Snow swirled in the dim light of dawn as Victor Kane's men poured into the cabin, their torches casting wild shadows on the rough-hewn walls, while Caleb fired with deadly precision, each shot echoing like thunder in the enclosed space, dropping one attacker after another. But there were too many, and they kept coming like a relentless tide. Sarah crawled through the cold, narrow tunnel beneath the cabin, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it would give her away. Every thud of boots above her head a reminder that Caleb was alone and fighting for his life. Behind her, muffled gunfire mixed with Victor's chilling laugh, a sound that froze her blood. Caleb moved like a man possessed, his storm-gray eyes burning with fury as he switched to his revolver, each bullet finding its mark, but the sheer numbers were overwhelming. A blow to the back of his head sent him sprawling, his rifle clattering across the floor. Two of Victor's men pinned him down, their rough hands binding his wrists with thick rope as Victor himself stepped forward, his fine coat untouched by the chaos, his expression calm and cruel. "Tie him to the post," Victor ordered coldly. "We'll leave him as bait. The girl will come for him. Women like her always do." Caleb spat blood, his glare defiant despite the ropes cutting into his skin. "You won't touch her," he growled, his voice raw but unbroken. Victor crouched beside him, his tone mocking. "You couldn't save your own family, Caleb. You really think you can save hers?" Caleb's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, refusing to give Victor the satisfaction of seeing his pain. Meanwhile, Sarah emerged from the tunnel into the frozen forest, gasping for air as she stumbled to her feet, her thin nightdress torn and soaked with mud. She looked back toward the cabin, her body trembling with rage and fear as she heard distant shouts. For a moment, she wanted to keep running, to disappear into the wilderness and never look back. But Caleb's voice echoed in her memory, his promise to protect her no matter the cost. Squaring her shoulders, Sarah whispered to herself, "I'm coming back for you." She followed the secret path Caleb had shown her earlier, winding through the trees until she reached a rocky ridge overlooking the valley. From here, she could see Victor's men dragging Caleb outside, tying him to a wooden post in the center of the clearing like an animal on display. Torches flared in the early light as Victor addressed his men, his voice carrying on the icy wind. "Spread out and find the girl. When she sees this cowboy's corpse, she'll understand what happens to those who defy me." Sarah's stomach twisted as she watched, helpless and furious. Then her eyes caught a glint of metal near the edge of the camp. Caleb's discarded rifle. Her mind raced. If she could sneak close enough to grab it, she might have a chance to free him, or die trying. As darkness gave way to a gray, bitter dawn, Sarah crept along the ridge, using the rocks and fallen logs for cover. Below, Caleb's head hung low, blood streaking his face, but his spirit unbroken. Victor turned to his men, his smile cold as he raised his hand for silence. "At sunrise," he declared, "we end this rebellion once and for all." Sarah clenched her fists, her pulse pounding. She knew she had only moments before sunrise broke the horizon and sealed Caleb's fate. Her fear burned away, replaced by determination, as fierce as the storm building in the sky. Tonight, Victor Kane would learn that even a hunted woman could fight back, and that she would risk everything for the man who had saved her life. Sarah froze at the ridge as the first pale light of dawn crept over the valley, her fingers numb around the cold metal of Caleb's discarded rifle. The sight of him tied to the post burning into her like an image she could never unsee. His chest rising and falling with ragged breaths, even as his eyes searched the sky for a mercy that did not come. Below, Victor's men laughed and spat and paced like wolves who had already tasted victory, certain the rebel heart that had burned their leader's pride could be smoked out and crushed. And Victor stood like a statue of ice at the center, his face a mask of triumph. But Sarah's fear calcified into something else, steel. And in that moment she decided she would not be the quiet thing anyone buried or the cowardly whisper that died in a corner. She would be the reckoning. Slipping from rock to rock, breath held, she moved like a shade, every branch snapping underfoot a hammer against her panic, until she reached the shallow hollow behind the last boulder and peered down to find Thomas barking orders and men checking ropes, unaware that the girl they had sworn was dead watched them with eyes sharpened by grief and fury. She tasted the smoke and felt the ash from the ruined cabins settle on her tongue, and thought of Caleb's hands digging her out of the earth when she was almost gone, his promise that he would not let them take her back into those hands, and that promise now drove her through the cold. Sarah waited until Victor raised his hand to call for another round, and in the heartbeat before the order left his lips, she crept forward, sliding down the slope where the snow had been trampled soft, the world narrowing to the rhythm of her pulse and the scrape of leather boots far above. And when she was nearly under the post, she crawled through the shadow of a felled log and lunged, grabbing the loose end of rope that looped around Caleb's wrists, fingers numb but steady, and pulled with everything she had, feeling the fibers bite into her palms as men above shouted in surprise and the world contracted to the two of them. Caleb's head swung toward her, eyes widening with a shocked, weary relief, and he twisted, using his shoulder as leverage while Sarah shoved and yanked until the rope slipped, finally giving, and together they collapsed into the snow, coughing and clutching each other as Victor's men barreled down the hill, torches like angry stars. Caleb shoved the rifle into Sarah's arms and shoved her behind a fallen wagon, while he rose with the stubborn, furious grace of a man who had lost everything and refused to lose this too, and the battle that followed was not clean nor glorious. It was brutal and close. A dozen men crashing among splinters and smoke, knives flashing, feet slipping in the wet blood and thawing snow. But Caleb fought with a clarity born of all he'd buried, taking blows and giving them back, his storm-gray eyes never leaving Sarah when she peered from cover. Every time she flinched, he returned her glance and mouthed, "Stay," and she did, though fear gnawed at her bones. At one point, Thomas lunged for her with a savage curse, and Caleb intercepted him, driving a boot into his chest and sending him skidding, while Victor, enraged, broke through the line and bore down with a raised saber, his face a twisted mask of ownership and hate. And as their eyes met, Sarah felt something ancient and terrible in him. the man who thought himself master of others' fates. And she realized the fight was always going to end with them. Calling on a courage that surprised even her, Sarah stepped from behind the wagon with the deed in her shaking hands. Pushing through smoke and shouting the truth she'd held, the ledger and signatures flashing in the morning light as she hurled it toward the crowd and screamed, "This is his! See what he steals!" For a moment, silence struck the valley like a physical thing as settlers and riders both stared. And then a murmur grew, suspicion cracking Victor's armor. But the man's response was pure venom. He charged at Caleb with a feral cry, sword slashing, and in a frantic, terrible duel, Caleb met him blow for blow, until at last, exhausted and bleeding, he forced Victor to his knees, and the saber clattered from his hand into the snow. Victor's last look was one of furious disbelief, as settlers, now seeing inked proof of his thefts, turned on the men who had followed him blindly, and when the sheriff stepped forward to take custody, hands trembling, Caleb sank to his knees beside Sarah, his breath ragged, and she fell into his arms, the deed clasped between them like an altar of hard-won truth. Around them the valley reeled from the cost, but the hunt had ended, and as the sun rose fully a weak, raw kind of peace settled over the ruined cabins. Sarah's voice trembled as she whispered, "We did it." And Caleb, blood and soot on his face, smiled through the pain and said, "No, you did it." The valley burned with the stench of smoke and betrayal as Sarah knelt beside Caleb, her hands trembling as she tried to untie the blood-soaked bandage around his arm, her own body shaking from the battle they had just survived, while around them Victor's surviving men were being disarmed by townsfolk who had turned against their former master after seeing the ledger she had revealed. Yet the danger was not over, because Victor himself was nowhere to be seen. And Sarah's heart pounded as she scanned the tree line, knowing the serpent would strike when least expected. Caleb's storm-gray eyes met hers, fierce even through the haze of pain. And his rough voice rasped, "You have to finish this, Sarah. If he lives, this never ends." Sarah's tears blurred her vision, but she nodded, gripping the rifle she had stolen, just as a chilling laugh split the morning air. Victor staggered from the smoke like a demon risen, his coat torn, his face streaked with soot and rage, a pistol clenched in one hand and a knife in the other, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you've won? I built this land with blood and fire. It is mine." With a roar he charged, and Caleb pushed Sarah behind him, rising unsteadily to face the man who had destroyed both their families. The clash was brutal and close, fists and blades flashing in a storm of fury as Sarah screamed Caleb's name, unable to intervene without hitting him. The two men locked in a deadly dance until Victor slashed Caleb across the chest and raised his pistol for the killing blow. Time seemed to freeze, Sarah's breath catching, and then instinct took over. She lunged forward, driving the rifle butt into Victor's wrist, sending the gun flying, and in the same motion Caleb seized Victor's own knife and drove it deep into his chest. Victor's eyes went wide with shock, a gurgling cry escaping his lips before he collapsed into the snow. The fire in him finally extinguished. For a long moment the valley was silent save for Sarah's sobs and Caleb's ragged breathing, until the crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising like a storm of freedom. Sarah cradled Caleb's head in her lap, whispering through tears, "Don't leave me. Please don't leave me." Caleb's lips curved into a faint smile, despite the pain. "I won't, Sarah. Not while you need me." As the townsfolk gathered around them, Sarah stood tall, holding the ledger aloft. "This man's reign is over," she declared, her voice carrying across the clearing. "No more fear, no more lies. This land belongs to its people." The crowd roared in agreement, and as the sun broke fully over the horizon, Its light fell on Sarah and Caleb standing side by side, battered but unbroken. Later, as they buried the dead and rebuilt the ruins, Sarah placed a marker at the site where Victor had fallen, not to honor him, but to remind everyone of the cost of silence. In the final scene, Caleb took her hand, his eyes softer now, and said, "We both came from graves, you and I. Let's build something that will never be buried again." Sarah smiled through her tears, leaning into his embrace as they walked toward a new life. Leaving behind the valley where betrayal had been burned away and a future born from the ashes. Snow fell softly over the valley, blanketing the charred remains of Victor's empire as Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing where so much blood had been spilled, her breath misting in the cold dawn, while Caleb leaned heavily on a crutch beside her, his storm-gray eyes sweeping over the land that had once been ruled by fear. The townsfolk worked tirelessly to rebuild, their voices rising with a determination that hadn't been heard in years. Yet beneath the surface there was unease, for though Victor was dead, the scars he left ran deep. Sarah clutched the ledger to her chest. Knowing it held the proof to restore rightful ownership to countless families, but it also contained dark secrets about her own kin, secrets that could shatter what little remained of her lineage. Caleb's rough, steady voice broke the silence. "You don't owe them anything, Sarah. Blood alone doesn't make a family." She turned to him, tears glimmering in her eyes. "I know," she whispered, "but I have to face them. I need to hear them admit what they did to me." Caleb's jaw tightened, the muscles in his scarred face working as memories of his own family's destruction threatened to rise. "Then I go with you," he said simply, leaving no room for argument. Together they rode to her family homestead, the once proud house now weathered and dark. When Sarah pushed open the door, the stench of stale liquor and guilt hung heavy. Her father sat slumped in a chair, hollow-eyed and broken, while her brother lurked in the shadows, his gaze filled with hate and regret. The sight made Sarah's stomach twist. But she stood tall, her voice clear and strong. "I know what you did," she said, holding up the ledger. "I know you sold this land to Victor and planned to kill me to hide your crime." Her father's head fell into his hands, a sob tearing from his throat, while her brother sneered. "We did what we had to do. You were always weak, always standing in the way." Caleb stepped forward then, his presence filling the room like a storm. "She was never weak," he growled. "But you are, for betraying your own blood." The brother's hand darted toward a hidden pistol, but Caleb was faster, slamming him against the wall with a force that rattled the house. "No more lies," Caleb said coldly. Sarah's father, weeping, confessed everything, his voice trembling as he begged for forgiveness. Sarah's tears fell silently as she turned away. "You already buried me once," she whispered. "I won't let you do it again." She left the ledger on the table, not as a gift, but as a weapon for the townsfolk to claim justice, then walked out without looking back. Caleb followed, his hand steady on her shoulder as they mounted their horse and rode toward the ridge. Behind them, the old house seemed to sag under the weight of its sins, a relic of a past that would no longer define them. At the top of the ridge, Sarah paused, gazing out at the horizon painted gold by the rising sun. "It's over," she said softly, though her voice trembled. Caleb wrapped his arm around her, drawing her close. "No," he murmured. "It's just beginning." Together they rode down into the valley, ready to build a future from the ashes, leaving behind the ghosts of betrayal and the promise that they would never again be silenced by fear. The days that followed were a blur of rebuilding and reckoning as Sarah and Caleb poured their strength into helping the townsfolk reclaim what Victor had stolen, the valley slowly transforming from a battlefield of despair into a fragile hope for the future. Smoke no longer curled from burning cabins, but from chimneys as new walls were raised, laughter returning to the streets where fear had once walked hand in hand with death. Yet even as progress blossomed, shadows lingered. Many families still whispered of debts owed to Victor's allies, and men loyal to him lurked on the outskirts, watching, waiting for weakness to strike again. Sarah stood in the heart of the town square with the ledger clutched in her hands, reading aloud the names of those whose land had been illegally seized, her voice carrying strong and sure as people cheered and wept, finally seeing proof of the crimes they had endured in silence. Caleb watched from a distance, leaning on his crutch, pride mingling with caution in his storm-gray eyes as he scanned the crowd for threats, his body still healing from the wounds he'd suffered, though his spirit remained unbroken. When Sarah finished, the townsfolk lifted her high on their shoulders, chanting her name. But Sarah's gaze found Caleb's across the square, and she shook her head, tears streaking her soot-marked cheeks. She climbed down, taking his hand and pulling him forward. "It wasn't me alone," she declared to the crowd. "None of us stand free because of one person. We fought together, and we'll build together." The people roared their agreement, and for the first time, Caleb allowed himself a small, rare smile. But even as joy surged around them, a scout burst into the square, breathless and pale. "Riders," he gasped. "Victor's cousins, a whole gang of them heading this way fast." A hush fell, fear rippling through the crowd like a cold wind. Sarah's heart seized, but Caleb's voice rang out steady and commanding. "Then we'll meet them together. This time we fight as one." He turned to Sarah, gripping her shoulders. "You've given them courage. Now you must give them a plan." Sarah swallowed hard, trembling under the weight of his faith. I don't know if I can." Caleb's gaze was unyielding. "You can, Sarah. You've already faced death and won." Taking a deep breath, Sarah climbed onto a wagon and raised her voice. "We will not bow to another tyrant. Build barricades at the ridge, arm everyone who can hold a weapon. This is our home, and we will defend it." The crowd erupted in a mix of fear and determination, scattering to prepare. Caleb stayed close to Sarah, his hand never leaving his revolver. As the sun dipped low, painting the valley in crimson light, the first distant hoofbeats echoed. Sarah's pulse raced, memories of her family's betrayal flashing like lightning in her mind. But when she looked at Caleb, she saw not doom, but a future worth fighting for. As night fell, torches lined the barricades, and the valley held its breath, ready for the coming storm. Caleb stood beside Sarah, his voice low but fierce. "No matter what comes, we stand together." Sarah nodded, gripping his hand as the thunder of hooves grew louder, knowing that this battle would decide not only their survival, but the soul of the valley itself. The night exploded into chaos as Victor's cousins and their gang of hardened riders stormed the barricades, their torches flaring like angry comets in the dark, while the defenders of the valley answered with a roar of defiance, rifles cracking and arrows hissing through the air, the clash of wood and iron ringing out as the fragile wall of logs shuddered beneath the weight of charging horses. Sarah stood at the center, her hair whipped by the cold wind, her voice rising above the din as she shouted commands to the people she had once feared to even speak to. Her courage igniting theirs as neighbors became warriors and families became a shield for one another. Caleb fought like a force of nature beside her, his storm-gray eyes blazing with grim resolve. Every shot he fired precise and deadly, even as blood soaked his bandages and pain threatened to drag him down. When the attackers breached the first barricade, the battle turned desperate and close, knives and fists replacing rifles, the snow trampled into mud streaked with crimson. Sarah's brother appeared suddenly in the melee, his face twisted with hate, screaming that she had ruined them all, and he lunged at her with a dagger. But Caleb intercepted him, their fight brutal and savage, ending when Caleb drove him back into the firelight and struck him down for good. Sarah barely had time to breathe before Victor's eldest cousin rode straight at her, sword raised high, and for a heartbeat she saw her own death reflected in his eyes. But then she remembered the shallow grave, the cold earth, and the moment Caleb's hands had pulled her free, and with a fierce cry she raised a rifle and fired, the shot echoing like thunder as the cousin fell from his horse. The gang's resolve faltered, fear creeping in as they saw their leaders fall, and the townsfolk surged forward with a cry of triumph, driving the invaders back step by step until at last the survivors broke and fled into the darkness, leaving the valley standing victorious under a sky streaked with smoke and dawn's first light. Silence fell, broken only by ragged breathing and the crackle of dying fires. And then the crowd erupted in cheers, lifting Sarah and Caleb high on their shoulders as tears streamed down her face. Caleb's voice was hoarse but steady as he addressed them. "No more tyrants," he declared. "This valley is yours, and no one will ever bury it in fear again." Sarah held his hand aloft, her heart swelling with pride and love. Days later, as rebuilding began in earnest, Sarah and Caleb stood together at the ridge where it had all begun, the marker of her false grave now transformed into a symbol of rebirth. She placed a wildflower on the stones and whispered, "This is where I was supposed to end, but instead it's where we began." Caleb wrapped his arm around her, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "We both rose from the ashes, Sarah. Let's make sure no one else ever has to." As the sun rose fully, its golden light spilling across the rebuilt valley, they rode down hand in hand, leaving behind the ghosts of betrayal and riding toward a future they had fought and bled to claim, knowing that their love and courage had forged a freedom no enemy could ever take away.